as it should. Right, bear with me 1 second. Brian, if you can just, oh no, did it the wrong way around again. There we go. You wouldn't believe that I actually did this for a living, would you? Right, let's have a look. Well, so have we got the right screen?
Next one.
Got the right one?
No, next one.
No. Let's have a look. Now we've got the right one.
It's not going. Oh, there we go. Yeah.
Got that one. Fantastic. Yeah. Brilliant. Excuse me. So this is the second in a series of 7 webinars that Brian and I are doing, which go through various stages of the recruitment process. And it's predominantly sort of targeted at recruitment businesses that are doing this on behalf of their clients. But it is just as applicable to anybody who's doing recruitment internally. So whether that be recruitment teams internally or HR teams or managers that are recruiting. And the second session is around bias and shortlisting. If I just change that down so that we can see more of the screen. And it's a huge area, and it's something that over the last sort of 6-7 months has become much more front and centre for people. It's something that's always been there, but it's something that people are now becoming a bit more conscious of and a bit more aware of. So what we wanted to look at first of all is, what is unconscious bias? Unconscious bias is something that we all have. It's just the way that our brains are built. It is the way that we work as human beings, and it's just things that we like, things that we don't like, and it can depend on where and how we were brought up, the schools that we went to, the people that we were surrounded by. And we're not just biased in terms of people, we're biased in terms of all sorts of different things. You know, I'm biased in favour of a McDonald's chocolate milkshake, which might not be, shouldn't really admit that publicly, should I? But it's the best milkshake you can get. Probably isn't, but that's my bias because that's the first milkshake properly I ever had. And also it's not something that just comes up within the recruitment process, but it's where it has the biggest impact for people and for people's lives, and the opportunities for people to progress based on capability, not on other factors that may not be within their control. And it's, even as an L&D practitioner, so whenever I used to walk into a training room, I'm Northern, I live down south, I have a bias towards Northerners. It's just, they make me feel comfortable somewhere where I'm surrounded by people who are Southerners. Most of my friends down here are Northerners, which is a bit bizarre. And so I will tend to be more friendly towards them, and maybe, you know, I'm very conscious of that. I'm also can be a bit biased against people with like really posh accents. Because of being Northern, they can or used to make me feel a little bit uncomfortable, a little bit. I always thought they were more educated than I was, and therefore knew more and more confident. And actually they're not, they're just human. So, but I'm very conscious of that. So I make the effort to be aware that, right, don't let that put you off this person. And, you know, it's amazing how that has changed how I deal with people. So they are things that we all have. And when it comes to the recruitment process, it can then cause problems. So Brian's going to talk you through a number of different ones.
Thanks, Helen. So I think just on that last slide, you'll have seen there's 2 pictures. I'm maybe a bit more cynical that most of my career at my previous employer was spent in operations. And I certainly have seen in my time unconscious bias, but actually bias, prejudice. And you'll see from the news, this is not a diversity webinar, but it ties in with diversity. It ties into the LGBTQ community, it ties into BAME, that people actually have not, it's not fair, you know, and that's not unconscious. That's when somebody is actually consciously saying, I don't want this specific individual into my business. So although we're not going to go down diversity, what I'll talk about a little bit is the importance of having a diverse workforce and the impact that bias has upon that, and why we should try to eradicate bias wherever we can. So this graph, this is something I use in my training with recruiters, and it's about the 13 types of bias. You'll find that different people will give you different elements. There's 8 types, there's 10 types, there's 4 types. You know, there's no right or wrong with this. But what I want to do is kind of highlight, and don't worry, I'm not going to go into each of them. I'll pick a few, and in the handout document, I've got something for everybody to look at the different types of bias and what that means to you as a recruiter, a hiring manager, or an internal recruiter as well. Now, the first thing I want to do, I want to out somebody in this. Now, I wouldn't normally do this in a webinar, but somebody who consciously put bias into an interview process, and that was me. So I had a situation about 6-7 years ago where I was hiring 2 consultants. I had 2 people at final interview, and I knew that the second individual probably wasn't right for the role. But the second individual has the same nationality as me. He'd only been in the UK for a year. He kind of reminded me of a young me. And all of a sudden, I remember sitting there, and I actually came home and I said to my wife, I'm going to take a risk. But the bias that I had there was one that was based around affinity bias. So we very similar. I could see why I wanted to do this, but actually I knew deep down this wasn't unconscious. This was a conscious decision I was making. And unfortunately, within 6 months, the person was no longer in the business. And it was at my fault. It was completely my error. And what I tried to do for me, I always try to learn from any kind of situation, whether it's positive, negative, or indifferent, that I knew I'd made a mistake from the start. But what I'd allowed to happen was not even, as I say, not even subconscious, but consciously, I let affinity bias come into my decision making. And that was not good for my team, for me, for the company, or and probably more importantly, for that individual. So that's just one type of bias that you know we look at. So there's a few others that I think is pretty interesting. That you know sitting listening to interviews, and what I do now, I facilitate a lot of interviews, and I hear people talking and making throwaway comments. And one of the other ones I want to highlight, because I think it happens to a lot of people, is beauty bias. So obviously for me, the mistake I have is I seem to go to sort of casting calls behind Colin Farrell, and I never seem to get the part. So I think obviously this bias exists, that's all I can say. But we do it quite a bit. And I was sitting facilitating an interview just a couple of weeks ago, and it was 3 or 4 ladies, and they said, I hope the next guy's good looking, Brian. I hope you're giving us a good looking guy. Now, that's a throwaway comment. It's off the cuff. It's a bit of a laugh. The person coming in actually wasn't that nice looking. There was an impact made because they were expecting someone, because of their name, to be pretty nice looking. Now, there's an impact psychologically there by having that bias. You must have seen companies, whether it be bars, restaurants, or even into the corporate world, where you think, wow, that's a very handsome team, male and female. Because actually people do hire based on that. And that's a huge one. And we fall foul of it because someone sits in front of you as a recruiter and think, wow, look at that individual. And again, it's understanding the difference that if you do that, you're allowing bias to creep in and actually not delving into their strengths, weaknesses, development areas, or matching them correctly to that company. So that's one that I always think about quite a bit. The other one is, if you look on your top right, affect heuristics. This is one that I think from working with recruiters for many, many years happens quite a bit, and it's superficial factors. And it's something that Helen mentioned, this is probably why I'm using it. We're both from the north. We went to the same school. He plays at my rugby club. Our kids go swimming together. Whatever it may be, we all holiday to the Dominican Republic. We choose affect heuristics a lot as a recruiter, both internally and as an external recruiter, to get a link with people. And then we find if we have that bias, we will try and sell them more to the client than we would someone that maybe we don't have that same similarity with. And I would say that this one is the one when I was preparing for today and kind of going through the grey matter at the back of my brain, was thinking about what were the ones that really I could say came up day in, day out. Now, I would say that all of them play a part, and I would also be pretty honest and say at some stage or other, I have utilized one of these without knowing it. I did mention the one that I was conscious of, but certainly subconsciously or unconsciously, there's bias through that. So why is it important? You know, we can talk about diversity figures and the government want us to meet quotas. Actually, it's proven that having a more diverse workforce is better for the business. So looking at McKinsey, what they've said is that for companies in the top quarter, so the top 25% of businesses, if they've got exec teams that have more diverse team fit or team as such, they're 35% more likely to have a greater profit. And that's based on a few facts. It improves innovation, it improves decision making, it improves workforce performance, it will boost employer brand, and it will increase the candidate pool. Because let's not forget that from a recruitment perspective, when we put bias in, we effectively, more often than not, decrease the candidate pool, because we're taking something where we're only looking at one specific individual, where they're from, you know, we like them, we don't like them, we emphasize a point, whatever it may be. So therefore, actually, it's vitally important to have a diverse workforce. And how you do that is actually by removing bias. Now, we're not saying that that will automatically improve numbers of, you know, it'll have a gender balance. It will improve ethnicity issues that the company may have. But what we're saying is the best person will then be found for the job. And that's what bias is about. It's trying to remove it. And for you as a recruiter to understand when it might be happening. And you'll know it. You'll know it from the minute you sit in front of that candidate for the first time or on the phone, or similarly as a hiring manager or internal recruiter when you're going through the process. And I think that bias, obviously, we're talking about shortlisting today rather than interviewing, but it does fall into the interview as well, because it's a human interaction, it's a human feeling. So Helen, if we can go on to the next slide, please.
Should be able to. Oh, there we go.
Okay, so what I wanted to do here was a few things in reducing shortlists. Now, what I think is always interesting is how people interview. And I can now say this as an external recruiter, as an internal recruiter, and as a facilitator. So I've finally got the holy trinity, the hat trick of all three. But you see, as interview shortlists go on, people start to cut corners. They cut corners because of bias. Oh, do you know what? I like Helen. We'll put it through. I know we didn't ask the question. Or we get to a shortlisting situation where you've been asking questions, but we stop asking the full set of questions. So there needs to be a standardized process, in my view, that people, to remove bias and to have a good true shortlist, candidates should all be asked the same questions. Yes, at the start of any process, you might be making small talk in a different way, but you're trying to have that not affect you in a way that you will bias the process. What it says here about, you know, talent acquisition people, it's about getting the right applicant pool. And the struggle they have is managing large applicant pools. The reason being, bias plays a big part in that. And what I've done here is just set a very basic example, albeit I would classify this as woolly because of the definitions and the rating. But it's about actually, what does that business require? What are you interviewing or asking questions about? And that therefore will give you a better understanding of being able to shortlist the individual. Now, you'll see there's been a big, if you have been following any kind of news within recruitment, staffing, employment, there's a big element now about rewording or reworking job descriptions to be gender neutral. And I was actually speaking to a client about this back in the summer, and he was very much of the same thought process of this smashing targets. It's all very masculine types of wording and terminology. And I think that what's interesting there is that we need to think about that at the start, and we're going to come to this in a session going forward. Because the job description starts everything long before you have the CV. The reason I've put it on there is that when you're reviewing a CV, that's how you should be reviewing it. And you should be doing the same with regard to if your client has given you a job description, you should be questioning about the wording. A blind CV review, very hard to do. So what I want to do is I picked out 2 things in a CV which are the most common elements. We look at a person's name and we look at dates. So when did they go to school? When did they go start the work? So what I wanted to do is just a very quick 30-second little interaction. You don't have to unmute, but I want you to think about this. I'm going to give you names of a squad. And you have to think about it straight away. The thing that comes to you, what country are these guys from? Derek Abu, Jarrell Kwanzaa, Louis Barry, Abdul Malik, Amadou Diallo, CJ Egan, and Liam Delap. So within your own mind, I bet you, Sherry, you're thinking of a country. Now, actually, the country's England. Now, what's interesting about it is the England under-17 football team. The surname Abu is English. The surname Kwanzaa is English. Barry, Abdul Malik, they all represent the same country. But on a CV, we're quick to think, oh, Abdul Malik, where is he or she from? We're putting gender, we're putting name, and then, oh God, they went to university in 1987. How old are they? How often are your clients asking you to look at this and look at age, look at gender? Is it something whereby bias has been removed? Now, for me, that's why I put this in the first slide. That's not unconscious bias. That is discrimination. And that's a whole different webinar we can go down. If you want to get me on a soapbox, that's the thing to get me on. But we're removing things because we're having bias in that shortlist. The scoring process is all about standardizing interviews, standardizing shortlist process. And before you do anything, consider likability. Do you like this person, and why do you like them? Is there one of those 13 biases within that liking, or is it generally that individual, by the very nature, has energy which can come to the business? But for me, one thing that I've heard, and I know there's quite a few people who are ex-Reed on the call, but over the time, people saying, listen, we want somebody young with lots of energy. Where's the cutoff of age? Where's the cut? What do you classify as energy? I've met a lot of 25-year-olds who had no energy, and a lot of 55-year-olds had plenty. I don't believe that they go hand in hand, but clients will ask you for that. We prefer to have a guy. And I want to give you probably another great example. I had a South African client, and he worked for a very big helicopter firm, and they're looking for a warehouse person, not a warehouse man, but a warehouse person. And he said to me, Brian, it has to be a guy. They're picking up big parts, so don't, no women in high heels, blah, blah, blah. Fine, and we advertised and we went out to find people. And the first person that applied was a lady, in fact, and she worked for DHL for 10 years. And I thought, no, I'm not going to discriminate. So I called her. So what do you do? She was, I manage the warehouse, massive parts. And she came in, and without a word of a lie, she had represented Lithuania in the hammer. She was twice the size of the warehouse manager, who she could have snapped in half pretty easily. So I called him and I said, right, I'm going to send you one candidate only, and you're going to hire her. And he said, well, no, it's a woman. Oh, and he could see the reluctance. What? He said, if I'm wrong, I'll buy you dinner, vice versa. And he phoned me back, and I won't say what he then used, the words he used after that. There was lots of F's and C's and B's. But again, the problem is we typecast individuals, we use bias. Yes, it's understandable to say for that client, listen, the individual will be picking up large parts of equipment in a warehouse, but that does not mean that has to be gender specific or age specific. And I think that's the bit that we have to consider. And then the final element, before I pose a question to you, is screen candidates in, not out. Because again, that's kind of what we call the horns effect, finding something why you wouldn't have it. I've always recruited people from this company, and it's never worked out. I had a blonde girlfriend when I was at uni, I don't like blondes anymore. The reason's not to hire somebody. And I think that's what people do. It's almost this 1970s good cop, bad cop. You know, you have the person walking in, I'm going to screen you out, a reason why you shouldn't be here. But you as a recruiter are representing yourself, your company, your client. As an internal recruiter, you're representing the business. And as a hiring manager, again, yourself in the business. So it's vital that you're screening in as opposed to out. Because again, you'll start to remove bias. And before I hand back over to Helen to add a few more things into, the question I want to pose to anybody on the call that's working with clients in this way at the moment, how often are you educating clients, whether that be hiring managers, stakeholders, or internal, external recruiters with regard to bias? When was the last time you had a conversation about this? And look back within yourself and think, when was the last time you allowed whether an unconscious or a conscious bias to happen because a client or a stakeholder said, I actually want someone that looks or sounds or has this. So Helen, I'll hand back to you.
Okay, fabulous, thank you. Just in summary, and just before I go through the summary, Brian and I are going to be around for another half hour or so if anybody's got any questions, because I think this is one of those areas that a discussion around it and questions that people have actually are a much better way to get lots of kind of relevant information out of this, because I've got a couple of things that I want to kind of discuss rather than kind of talk through. So, but in summary, fundamentally, we all have unconscious biases, and the first step is being aware that we have those biases and making them conscious biases rather than unconscious. And have a look at that bias wheel and think about where yours might be. I know when I was recruiting as a manager, for me, I would occasionally, if somebody was leaving and I was replacing that person, in my head, I'd be looking for another them. And that might not always be the right thing for that role. So I became very, very conscious of asking myself some questions around that, because unconsciously that's what I'd start to do. So when you're spotting that you're actually applying those unconscious biases, actually take some mitigating action and put some processes in place. And some of that is creating a recruitment process that reduces opportunity for bias. And if you can have more than one person involved in that shortlisting process to begin with, just to prevent any of your individual biases. And making sure that when you're shortlisting, that you're relating back the skills that you're using to the skills that you identified as being important back at the preparation stage. And this is something we talked about last time, is actually preparing and understanding what it is you're looking for. Because again, those biases can shift our thought process from actually the person that we need for that role, or the skills we need for that role, to someone we might like or be interested in, or what have you. So in terms of the slides, I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, so then we can have a bit of a chat about that. So that's fine. We've lost the slides now. Everyone back? Fabulous. You can see that bit. Lovely. There we go. I don't know how I managed to do that. One of the things that a lot of the job boards do now is allow you to ask questions, so you can kind of pre-screen people automatically there. What are your thoughts on those? Right, sure.
I think personally that the pre-screen questions are a sort of blessing and a curse at the same time. I think that asking the right question can be really, really useful. However, most people don't ask the right question. So, for instance, if you're going into a recruitment position and the hiring manager asks how many years recruitment experience have you got directly in the recruitment business, you might say, well, I've not necessarily got any, but I've been, for example, in my situation, I've been a head chef for 3-4 years. I've been recruiting staff, so you've been doing it for your own team rather than for someone else. And if you put in, I've got no experience, you might then just be taking the process straight away without them not necessarily looking at your CV and say, wait a minute, it does have a lot of transferable skills. So I think asking point blank a sort of yes or no question, it's got a definite sort of closed response rather than a very open response. could probably hinder you in the recruitment process. So I don't really like them, to be honest. I think phoning candidates that have the experience are saying the right things in their summary and having a conversation with them is the best way to go about it. It takes a wee bit more time, but you'll probably get more sort of better standard of results from it rather than a generic pre-screening question.
I think it's a good example. I know Chris, and he came in to read from working in industry, and he hit the ground running. And I think if you were to ask the question, you've been very bashful with it, Chris, by the way, just to say that the industry would have not had such a good recruiter in it, because people would have said, well, you're a chef, so you don't know what you're doing. And I think you're right. We're kind of, you can veer off here and say it's about those core attributes, those core skills. And similarly, it's that same idea of the bias. I'm going to make a call because I see something or I don't see something that on your CV or you, and I can't make I can't close that bridge. Say, actually, let me understand more about you to make a decision whether you'd be good or not. And you've proved that within the industry from coming into it.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, we've got a question from Athol. Can you share any behavioural learning techniques used to stop biases forming during the interview process? So, Brian, is there?
I think, Athol, probably the awareness of the different types of bias would be the first one. I would also say self-awareness is the first bit, because it's such a personal thing rather than running through what you could go. I think you probably can get courses online that will help you do this, or trainers that do it. It's not something that I would do. It's more an awareness thing of, if you understand these 13 types of bias, and as Helen touched on in the summary, if you know that that's one that you maybe lean towards, it's more a case of understanding it and then having an awareness of it, because we all will always have a bias. Even sitting here today, it's no different. I call it the dating effect with some of my private clients, that there's a reason why we like each other, why we date each other, why we have friends. We all have a bias in it, but it's more a case of, is that bias affecting your hiring process, whether unconsciously or not? And I think understanding those 13 and being able to think, well, where do I fall into this? If not all 13, but one or two of them, that will help you. And it's more, I don't think there's much more you can do apart from recognizing it. And then before you go into any interview or any shortlist situation, understand where your pitfalls may be and address them prior to the interview. I hope that helps. A bit woolly, I know.
I think as well is kind of during the interview process is going back to that preparation stage and having the skills that you're looking for, and having a scoring process where you then have a number of people who are doing that scoring, and discussing those scores before you kind of discuss sitting down and scoring properly yourself individually, and then discussing those afterwards. Because if you are scoring for specific skills, what you're doing then is making sure that you're helping yourself kind of avoid those biases there, because and again, as Brian said, I would advocate that whole looking at that, being aware of those different biases, making sure you're aware of. So yeah, I thought pre-planning, preparing, making sure that you're really conscious.
And I think that goes back to the job description. How often do employers, whether that's yourself as line managers or your clients, who's written the job description? What's it been written for? Because what I find, we used to use a technique called the 5-3-1, which any of you that work with me will know that. And how often would you get to that with a client and say 5-3-1? These are one thing. Oh, but what about this? What about that? And that's not actually being put onto the job description. Now that could be because we as recruiters haven't been more thorough. It could be that the client has always done it this way. And I think that if the job description is relevant, that's what, as Helen said, that's what you're scoring against. And the danger is, and this is probably another conversation, is that soft skills are obviously important, but soft skills do have a more of a lending itself towards bias, because then there's a bit where it's subjective rather than objective.
And then we've got Kev, where you've got that sexism bias, which is where I've got a friend who's got a nanny. They don't have a nanny, they have a manny, so they have a male nanny, which was quite an unusual thing a few years ago, but is now becoming more common because I think there is less of an expectation of the gender bias within those roles. But I remember back in my early days on a temps desk being asked by a certain local car dealership for a temporary receptionist, can we have the blonde with the big boobs? And the temptation to send them Steve, who was a blonde bloke and a big guy, was very tempting. And this is back in the last century when it was considered more.
No, that's just me throwing it out there. I mean, there's a whole other session on that probably, but I've always thought to myself, I'm on LinkedIn a lot and you hear it and you see it, oh, why can't we apply for that? Why is there no leaders and women? Why are we saying, oh, new CEO for BP is a woman? Why are we saying woman? Why is it just a person? And I always thought to myself, what's the problem with them ever doing that role? If they wanted to do that role from the outset, if they've got the skills and the attributes, as you say, and the persona, and they fit in with the team, does it matter what, male or female? And I go both ways with that. If they want to go offshore, go offshore. If they want to do an office role, do the office role. I've never quite worked out why there was no bias, as you say, towards one.
That's the issue with the CV. I mean, I said this to someone the other week, and I put it, I think, on LinkedIn. There was a bit of a mixed reaction. We live in the most technological age ever, because as life goes, everything becomes more technological. But yet we still use a two-page bit of paper, which we used in the 1960s and 70s as the be-all, end-all. So you're trying to get your life into 2 pages, because you shouldn't have 3, because applicant tracking systems don't like it. People will get bored. But actually, it's not like Andy who's on the call. Andy, 20 odd years in the same company, director. How do you get that into 2 pages? It's not really. Why should that be the same? I'm sure when Andy, when he graduated, it would have been hard to find a 2-page CV. As you're 21 years in, you could probably write 20 pages, but no one wants to read it. So we're still using a system which 50 years ago was broken, but we didn't maybe know that, because in the 1970s, you have people like Benny Hill running around, for goodness sake. So 50 years on, now we've understood the repercussions of not having a diverse workforce, but yet we still have your name at the top. Some people put their date of birth, their street and their address. And of course, what you're allowing that to do is someone reading that will make a judgment call, as we all do. And I think it just kind of ties on something, Athol, you've asked there again. Can bias be positive? I would personally say, and I don't know what the group would say, but I would probably say it wouldn't be. Where you might want to just differentiate is that you're looking at soft skills which are important, that you're not putting a subjectivity onto. So is somebody, do they show drive? Do they show energy? Do they show problem solving? So proper hardwired skills of an individual, which either improve or don't. Does that individual have that? And that's what you're probably looking at. So I wouldn't use the word bias, but I would think about soft skills that are a lot more objective than being subjective. I hope that kind of answers that a little bit.
It's interesting, Brian, on the soft skills bit. I don't know, have you seen there's been quite a few little debates, which I'm quite passionate about this, and as you know, I'm not one to back down from a strong view, about whether or not people should include their hobbies on CVs.
Yeah, I think you and I had this conversation, didn't we?
Yeah, I'm a massive fan. You should, and I'll be honest. And this is a little bit of a bias of mine, but I think it's a good bias. So to back you up on the soft skills bit, you talk about you write a CV is a list of skills. So parking, anything else. You can go, okay, it's a Java developer. Have they done Java? Yes. How much Java? This, brilliant. That's all good. But when I was hiring recruiters, particularly at Reed, when we couldn't find, or we weren't able to get experience. We had to look at raw talent. So, I mean, I made a list here. We talk about experience. My top billers were an ex-butcher, hairdresser, builder, and someone who sold wine. So I literally, my view was...
This is about food, drink and property, isn't it?
Yeah. Literally, if anyone kind of sent me a CV, I'm like, I'll speak to them. But for me, the reason I love hobbies are, from a soft skill point of view, is if someone can share. And I had a bit of a argument, too strong a word with a guy who disagreed and said it didn't matter. And I was like, okay, I like to see hobbies on there, because if someone's passionate about something, whether it's stamp collecting, train spotting, they're in a bridge club, darts club, they don't have to be an Olympic athlete or a captain of the netball team or anything. I'm not bothered what it is, but I like to see that someone does something. I mean, yeah, socialising with friends and spending time with your family, bit generic, doesn't really say a lot. But anything else, I love seeing it, because again, from a soft skill point of view, it shows that someone's got a bit of passion about something outside of work. They're willing to commit time. It might be they volunteer, they litter pick. I don't care what it is. It just, for me, shows a soft skill and an ability. So, yeah, so I probably have a little bit of a bias there. It's a positive bias.
That might answer.
And again, I wouldn't not interview someone hobbies.
So I think for me, so my views is exactly yours, but in the flip, that if that the reason why you would take somebody, because people don't know how to write a CV at the best of times, I would say, and then they will put on from the weird to wonderful. Now I think what I was taught to do years ago was I put down what I'd done at uni. So I played in this sport and that sport, and someone said to me, "You shouldn't do that. Just put down something else." My wife said, "Why don't you flip this round and say when you were at uni, you played in this sport and you did fundraising?" Because that then shows a commercial activity rather than just that. Now, she wasn't in recruitment, she was in marketing. And I thought that's a really good point. And I had that in my CV for years. But my view is that you've only got 2 pages. Is that the driver, or is it actually what you've done, your core attributes? Because, there is bias, and I think it's down to personal, it's what you like, and also what we're used to. And the one thing I would say, Andy, where it probably is more important, and not that I think we still have we're not in full agreement, but if there's no covering letter, at least you get to see a bit of the human element, I would say. But I think if it's a covering letter, do you need to have that? And it does, depending on the individual, it can create a bias. I think that's the problem. People will choose to read it for whatever way. Oh, they went to this school, or they run for this club, and I run for the club across the water, and we're not taking that.
I think
I would never prejudice against someone who didn't have that in there. But it just on the top of my mind, but it's something that I've seen 2 or 3 posts on it on LinkedIn, and I would I like to see it, particularly where the experience isn't there. So I would never favour another runner. So if there's 2 CVs exactly the same and one's a runner and one isn't, I wouldn't favour the runner. I'd pick the best person for the job.
Yeah.
But quite often I'm looking for people without, or used to be looking for people without experience, and for me it was just another useful bit of information.
Yeah, and I suppose it probably breaks back down to we're using an antiquated way of finding the best people. And I think we've got a session on CVs at some stage, but that's just for me that it probably has a more human element, but it does lend itself to more bias. But the problem there is we're back to you've got 2 pages of A4 paper to try and secure yourself an interview, which I still think is not really fair in 2020.
I think
another very interesting bias. Now I'll just leave this out there and see what everyone thinks is. I think that historically there's always been a little bit of a bias towards people that are immediately available.
For them or against them?
Oh, against.
Yeah.
Definitely. I was asked I won't mention the company. I won't mention the company, but I was interviewed on a Zoom interview last year by the EMEA MD of a global recruitment agency, who said to me, "Like your CV, like everything you've done, but come on, be honest. No one lets the best people go. Why are you really looking for a new role?"
Yeah.
So.
But then if you flip it as external recruiters, I know of somebody in our previous business that's how they ran their business. must be immediately available because we want the fee to come in now. And again, I suppose, yeah, I think overall, there's a negative tendency. You don't let your best people go. Or why would you leave a job not to be in a job? And that's, again, a transition from the 1970s and 80s where people were one or two jobs in a career. We're not. And, someone like yourself, Andy, 20 odd years, so it's not as if you're a job hopper, but
No.
you're not going to be in a job, you're not going to stay in the same job and get the gold watch after 40 years. So there's an educating, and I would say I'm going to show a bit of bias. There's an educating of a certain generation, I believe, that has to think a bit differently with regard to, I might have chosen to take 6 months off. I may want to go to the gig economy and do X, Y, and Z. So yeah, I'm with you on that. I think it's a negative trait.
I think it will change.
It's changed my view because it was an unconscious bias I probably had, and then I've been on the receiving end of it. So actually, it's in a weird way, it's probably done me a favour. I probably was a bit old school. I'm honest enough to admit I might have had a slightly negative view in the past when I was in a role for 20 years of immediate availability. But actually now I've realised, having gone through it, and obviously with COVID, actually so it's probably done me a favour and it's reprogrammed me. So it's probably helped.
I think it will change out of this, because I think a lot of people, we're going through another one of those periods where a lot of people are losing their jobs through no fault of their own. And I think it really will, when the economy, as it will, because it's a cycle, starts to pick up properly, the great people who are actively looking at that point will disappear very quickly. I think a year after that, the question will be, you're still available.
Yeah. And I think pre-COVID, I'd given a talk to a big agency, and they were talking about millennials in the workplace, because millennials at the moment, are just about to take over the workplace with regard to age. And there was a lot of stuff coming from America in the middle 2018 through 2019 about the gig economy, that youngsters now want more and more flexibility. I do say youngsters because that is the generational number. And they don't necessarily want to be working Monday to Friday, 9 to 5, 5 weeks off. They want to have roles where there's a flexibility. If they want to take 3 months off and go traveling, they come back, they get another job. And I'd love to see this call in 100 years, what people are talking about and saying, I can't believe you only get 6 months off out of every 12, whatever we come to.
I'm just going to run through, we've got a couple of questions, or a couple of comments in here. So if bias is formed by names presented, possible hobbies, why should CV not become nameless, ageless, hobbyless, and only focus on the skill set against the job brief? Then there's no bias. Have you discussed this option? And then Eugenie, is there? Check that's all right, fantastic. The civil service recruits, remove all personal data.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. Firstly, after that's what should happen. And Eugenie, I think that's great to see that there's two elements, but I would say, unfortunately, they're the exception to the rule when it comes, and people, where are they from? People want to ask that question. And I'd have to say, going back, if I handed over 5 CVs to a client who I didn't know was maybe a new client as an external recruiter and they had nothing on them, I'd have had a phone call saying either we're not taking them, or can you tell me who they are, what they do? But going back to Athel's point, yeah, that's the fairest way. That's the only way to do it. But I think historically, habitually, people expect a CV to look a certain way. Must have your name, must have your address, must have your phone number, and on we go and on we go. But that would be the fairest way to do it. So you need a genius to come up with an applicant tracking system that can do that, you see.
And I think it is about education, isn't it? And I think where, this isn't the forum for a kind of the diversity and inclusion conversation, but it obviously butts up against this significantly. And I think we are coming to a point where it's being discussed, and that is such a step forward. And the fact that people are now much more aware, and it's uncomfortable quite often for people to have those conversations, but people are aware of those, and people are more comfortable to say, hang on a minute, I want to question that recruitment process because I'm not convinced that was fair. I think there was bias there, and that is being supported. And I know there's still a long way to go, but it's much more front and centre, and I hope that it continues to be so, because I know there's been big leaps before and then it's kind of slid back, and I just hope that this is a point where this, and as if you are a recruiter and if you are someone who is working with clients, this is where it's your legal obligation to have this discussion with clients, because if there is a discrimination claim against an employer, if you're the recruiter who has put that candidate forward and your process is biased or is discriminatory in any way, then you are equally as liable for that. And I think that is where you have the absolute right, not right, that's the wrong word, you have the absolute moral obligation to have that conversation, because you have a legal obligation as well. And if clients are asking you for specific things, you have to be going back and telling them that they can't, and if it's their unconscious bias that they're not even aware of, it's your opportunity to educate them in that. And you know, I know I've done frontline recruitment, and I know that under pressure in a lot of companies where the pressure is to get results, the ethics and the morals can sometimes be pushed to one side, and that is what gives recruitment a bad name. And I think if you're in, as an individual, you have to take that responsibility for not being party to that and doing things the right way, and being aware of your own biases, being aware of your clients' biases, and putting the steps in that you need to mitigate for those. Because we all are the only people who can ever do. We can only change our own behaviours, can't we? We can try and influence others, but we can only change what we do. Athol, and again, Athol, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. How brand identity or cultural values of a business impact bias? Really good question. Because Divine and I had this conversation the other day. We were talking about culture fit, weren't we? And said, I wonder if the culture fit question will come up here.
Yeah, one thing there, Arthur, and this, I may be off the wrong track, but I remember years ago, when I was in banking, I was walking past Office Angels, so very big high street brand, and they had a job in the window for an IFA kind of role, IFA administrator. I thought that would suit me. And I looked at all the branding, and I looked above the door, and I thought, actually, this is only for women. I can't go in here. So I'm kind of flipping it a little bit in that obviously brand identity caused me not to go in, but I think depending on the branding, it can impact. And overall, you'll find that cultural values and an actual impact of bias will affect the brand, because you look at anything from McKinsey through to LinkedIn, through to HubSpot, they've got quite a lot online about this, that what is the impact for people coming into the business. So for attraction, for new employees coming in, again, going back to the millennial generation Z, they want an all-inclusive company to work in. So values, morals, brand, that all will have an effect. So I think that, you know, there's two ways, depending on how you brand yourself, will have an effect. And similarly, if you use bias, you'll end up just having the same, you know, the mirror image of yourself, depending on the bias that you have. And as I said back in the presentation, it's been proven now that having a more diverse workforce improves, you know, revenue, improves productivity, improves decision making, improves actually better work ethic as a team. So yeah, I think that would be a big one. And brand identity, you know, again, choosing a recruitment one. I remember seeing an advert really early on when I joined Reed about old adverts, and it was Kelly Services, and it used to say, "Have you got your Kelly girl?" Because Kelly Services did secretarial and office support, and it was a silhouette of what I pictured of a 6'3" leggy lady, because that was the silhouette. But that was in the 1950s and 60s. They were advertising, "Do you have a Kelly girl?" So it kind of goes back to Kev, what you were saying about the receptionist. It does, you know, it's when we're talking about bias, we're not talking about this from a specific set of individuals. It's not about gender. It's not about ethnicity. It's about everybody, that you're going to lose out somewhere. And generally, we know the people who lose out more. So yeah, I think it's a very, very big deal. It will become more so as this decade goes on, and as COVID hopefully starts to be, you know, a thing of the past, or at least we live with it.
And I think that's the thing, you know, culture comes from the leadership and the leadership team, and kind of devolves down, because they decide what is and isn't acceptable. So the culture and the biases that affect that leadership team are going to affect the culture, and what is acceptable and isn't acceptable spreads throughout the business. And you know, I don't know if you've ever done it. I remember going to work somewhere and I stayed there for 4 weeks because it absolutely wasn't the place for me, and it took me 4 weeks to realise that. And I basically handed my notice in. I had a week's notice, and I handed my notice in at the end of week 3 because it just was not the right culture for me, because of the leadership and the way that they ran things. And I think that is where, again, as if you're recruiting, whether you're an internal recruiter or you're doing that on behalf of someone, is being aware of that, and your role is then again to kind of educate around that bias, or choose the clients that you work with. Social media influence bias when recruiting. I think social media influences everything. Personally,
I think it's more than just bias with social media. That, you know, there's things that you shouldn't do in social media, and I think those waters now are getting muddied. You know, whether it's something like LinkedIn, which was a very different site 12 years ago to what it is today. Twitter deregulation, again, probably another webinar for another day. But I think that actually social media, what it's good for is, and maybe going back to Andy, what you were saying about the CV, is what social media does allow you to do. If you can remove the bias, you can actually see an individual for who they are. But I do think it still will put a bias depending on, because you'll see how somebody looks. You'll know more about them rather than the CV. But again, going back to what I said originally, I think if you know where your pitfalls may be, it's trying to address that when you're looking at that individual's profile, which we all, I think, as recruiters, we probably all do now. You know, we would see a CV and we automatically go to a LinkedIn, even a Facebook or an Instagram, and look up that individual.
It's maybe one for a different call, but bias in terms of sector bias, you see that a lot? And I mean that in a case of, I'm a sales professional, I've been for 15 years. I'll be a little bit, in a sense, that I think I pretty much sell anything given half a chance, but you'll still get the bias on the application for must have years experience in pharma, must have years experience in manufacturing, must have. For me, if I work my process A to B and follow it like I've always done, I'm not saying you shouldn't hire the right guy with 10, 15 years in that sector, because naturally I have the contacts, but sometimes a fresh approach works. You know, your take on that. Because I was hired for Panalpina and I lasted a good 3 years there, and I was the first hire outside of logistics. You know what I mean? So I wonder what your take on that was.
Well, I think probably up in the northeast, it's such a big thing with oil and gas, non-oil and gas. I think we touched on that last week. There is a bias, but I think it all comes back down to the job description, and it's for those, you know, for those within the recruitment field to say, you know, I think as Chris was saying earlier on, it's back down to those questions. Chris came from industry into recruitment. The industry wouldn't have had such a good recruiter if we'd always just a chef, and you can't be anything else. And I think that's the problem. It comes back down to the skill set, sorry, the core skills on a job description. That, you know, if the job description, what's it stipulating? Why do you need to have experience in logistics, oil and gas, manufacturing, recruitment? Because I think it depends as well. And I think Andy, probably exactly like myself, we ended up for a while recruiting people you know, we were basing it on their core skill set because there just wasn't recruiters about. You know, for who you want isn't always there. But is it a bias, or is it just again a hardwired? This is what this industry does, which again I suppose you could argue is a bias towards anybody who's not conforming. So it's possibly a conformity bias that if you don't conform to being in this sector, you don't get the job.
Especially when they suggest, they maybe suggest must have this, but then they'll say hunter attitude. Well, the hunter attitude could be anyone, because if you're coming in to hunt, you're going after new business, so you're not going to take your clients over. You know what I'm saying? I'm just trying to get it that way, because I see a lot of that. And another question outside of that, maybe one for some other week, would be, I've caught a lot of posts on LinkedIn over the last month or so about interview and techniques. When you go for an interview, it can be quite daunting. It doesn't matter who you are, because in front of 2, 3, 1 person, and it's quick fire. You've got to be prepared. You've got to do your research. You've got to know and read the videos and what you should prepare for. And then the flip side was, why don't they meet these people? Relaxed environment, over a coffee, and have a chat and get to the crux of them, the role, lightly, as opposed to them maybe not being great in the interview because they're thinking they're going to be a robot and answer the questions and get the feedback and give it back, as opposed to she might be a different person in a relaxed coffee environment.
Do you know what, Kev? It's like we prompted you, because next week's webinar is the recruitment process and the candidate journey. It is exactly that subject. Anybody would think we'd paid you to do that. That's exactly what we're going to talk about next week, because it is, I think, again, you know, the tide is turning, the world is shifting, and it is very much, I used to work for a company that did outsourced recruiting for a particular organisation, and they once put a candidate through 5 interviews, and it would normally be 2 interviews, but they kept going, oh, can you meet this person, can you meet that person? In the end, the person who did the interview, they went, no, you're all right. It's all right. If they can't make a decision about me, I'm not interested. So
I had 3 interviews and a psychometric test for Panalpina. So there you go.
Yeah. So, but it's about how and why every element of that is in there, and what and how that is explained to the candidate, what they're hoping to get out of it. And you're absolutely right. You know, the interview is something that some places make into something that is much more painful than it has to. For getting the best out of people. I'm very conscious that it is 10:30, and everyone has jobs and lives and things to get on with. So thank you very, very much for your time. Thank you for joining us. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope there's some fantastic questions and conversations there, which is brilliant. What I will do, I'm going to stop recording now.